teenager, a speeding car, no brakes. 4 people's lives changed forever in 4.74 seconds. That's all the black box recorded before impact. The case of Mackenzie Shirilla shocked America, landing her a murder conviction for a crash that her father insists was never intentional. Now, for the first time, Steve Shirilla is stepping into the spotlight, not just to defend his daughter, but to challenge everything the prosecution claimed to know. The documentary reignited public outrage, but Steve says the real story was buried in editing rooms and courtroom omissions. Evidence allegedly changed. Witnesses contradicted themselves. A giant road dip the city quietly filled in after the crash. One father's truth versus a prosecutor's verdict. Buckle in. Here's a question that set the internet on fire. Did a father's casual attitude toward marijuana cost his daughter her freedom? During the documentary, Steve made a comment about who he is to tell someone they can or can't smoke.
What I was saying is that who am I to say who can smoke and who can't smoke? Now,
it was clipped, shared, and condemned within hours. But context, as always, is everything. Steve had sat through 2 full days of interviews. That answer was one thread pulled from an hours-long conversation. He never endorsed marijuana use. He was wrestling out loud with the helplessness every parent of a teenager knows too well. He had warned Mackenzie repeatedly. He just couldn't physically stop her. Parenting a 17-year-old isn't a controlled experiment. You teach, you warn, then you hope. The documentary stated no drugs were found in Mackenzie's system, but that's not the complete picture. Steve revealed that discovery documents showed 3 markers for marijuana. 2 were inactive. The third, it potentially indicated operating a motor vehicle impaired. Prosecutors reviewed it and chose to pursue murder charges instead of an impairment charge. That decision alone raises serious questions. Why would a prosecution team bypass an arguably easier OMVI charge in favor of murder? Steve's answer is blunt. They wanted the bigger conviction. Their own expert acknowledged the OMVI case was improvable, yet they pressed forward with murder, building their entire case on 4.74 seconds of nonlinear black box data. When the evidence is thin, the charge often reveals the motive.
Enormous charge. Minimal proof.
Here's what almost no one in the media covered: the road itself. Before Mackenzie's car ever crossed that intersection, it hit a massive dip in the pavement. Steve says when he drove through that same stretch at speed, his own car went airborne. There are bottom-out marks in the cement. The city repaired that dip quietly over the summer after the crash. After the conviction, their automotive expert testified that the car's safety system detected what it interpreted as a rollover 5 to 6 seconds before impact. Both side airbags deployed. The black box didn't even begin recording until that moment, meaning prosecutors had no data on what the car or driver was doing before the chaos started. The road was dangerous. The data was incomplete. The conviction was permanent. Everyone trusts a black box. It sounds scientific, definitive, untouchable. But here's what the prosecution never highlighted in open court. Mackenzie's black box recording was nonlinear. It didn't capture a smooth, continuous record of events. It switched on only after the car's safety system detected a potential rollover, giving investigators a fragmented 4.74-second window. That's less time than it takes to read this sentence aloud twice. Steve's automotive expert was clear: you cannot reconstruct driver intent from a nonlinear snapshot. The box recorded speed and mechanical response, not decisions, not panic, not a medical episode, not a system malfunction. Yet that tiny slice of data became the prosecution's cornerstone, the foundation of a murder charge against a teenager. 4 seconds of data, 1 lifetime of consequences. That's the math here. What do you do when you've turned over every rock and still found nothing? Apparently, if you're this prosecutor, you call it murder anyway. Steve recounts a stunning moment from the documentary where the prosecutor openly admits he examined everything available and couldn't find a clear explanation, then concluded the crash must have been intentional. That logical leap is extraordinary, and not in a good way. In criminal law, the absence of an innocent explanation is not proof of guilt. Intent must be demonstrated, not assumed by elimination. Steve draws a pointed comparison. It's the same flawed reasoning that makes investigators instantly suspect a husband when a wife dies. Lazy pattern recognition dressed up as prosecution. No motive, no prior planning, no intent. Just a verdict. While his daughter fights a murder conviction, Steve Shirilla is fighting a different battle, keeping his job. After the documentary aired, concerned parents flooded the diocese with calls. Within days, Steve was placed on paid administrative leave pending an investigation. 7 years of dedicated teaching, and not a single person from the school picked up the phone to speak with him first. That detail is worth sitting with. Before any investigation, before any conversation, the institution distanced itself publicly. Steve has reached out to the diocese requesting dialogue. He's heard nothing back. The man who shaped students' futures for nearly a decade is now waiting in silence for an institution to decide his worth based on edited sound bites. Loyalty, it turns out, runs on a very short clock. Painfully short. There's a version of this story where Steve Shirilla is the villain, the permissive parent who looked the other way while his daughter made dangerous choices. Then there's the version he's living, a father who warned, pleaded, and ultimately hit the wall every parent of a teenager eventually finds. You cannot follow them everywhere. You cannot intercept every decision. You can only teach and then release. When pressed about why he didn't simply take her car keys, Steve's answer was painfully honest. He had no idea she was smoking while driving. The videos showing that were new information even to him. His warnings about marijuana were real. His ignorance of that specific habit was equally real. Both things can be true simultaneously. Good parents don't always get good outcomes. That's the hardest truth of all. Say the word innocence about Mackenzie Shirilla in most rooms and you'll get immediate pushback. She was behind the wheel, the car was speeding, people died, but Steve makes a distinction that the legal system itself is supposed to protect: the difference between a tragic accident and premeditated murder. Recklessness and intent are not the same charge, not the same crime, and absolutely not the same moral category. The prosecution's own case had no established motive, no prior threats, no history of violence toward the victims, no digital trail suggesting planning. What they had was a terrible outcome and a theory built backward from the wreckage. That's not evidence of murder. That's evidence of a crash with an unexplained cause. Unexplained does not automatically mean intentional. That distinction matters enormously. Picture this: you're driving, you hit an unexpected dip in the road at speed, your car lurches violently, and suddenly both side airbags explode outward. Your instincts are overwhelmed in a fraction of a second. Now ask yourself, in that moment, are you a murderer or a terrified teenager in a car that just made its own catastrophic decision? Steve's automotive expert says the airbags deployed 5 to 6 seconds before the car ever crossed that fatal intersection. That timeline is seismic. It means the vehicle's own safety system was already in full emergency response mode before the moment prosecutors claim Mackenzie chose not to brake. A car deploying side airbags creates instant sensory chaos, noise, force, obstruction. Expecting calm, deliberate brake application immediately after is not just unrealistic, it may be physically impossible. The car reacted before the driver could. Full stop. Here is something that should have generated far more headlines than it did. The dangerous road dip that Steve describes. The one his own car flew over at moderate speed. The one with visible bottom-out scrape marks in the concrete was repaired by the city quietly, after Mackenzie's crash and after her conviction. No announcement, no acknowledgement of road hazard liability, just fresh asphalt over a problem that should have been fixed years earlier. In any thorough accident investigation, road conditions are foundational evidence. If that dip demonstrably caused vehicles traveling at normal speeds to become airborne, it belonged front and center in the defense's case. Steve's team documented it with video. They captured the scrape marks. But once the city filled it in, a piece of physical, environmental context disappeared permanently from the public record. Infrastructure failure leaves no defendant. Only victims do. Imagine sitting across from documentary producers for 2 full days, pouring out your grief, your legal arguments, your parental guilt, and your daughter's case in exhaustive detail, then watching the finished product reduce all of that to a handful of clips that paint you as a negligent father who endorsed drug use. That is exactly what Steve describes when he reflects on the documentary experience. He doesn't deny his words, he denies their context. This is the fundamental tension of documentary filmmaking. The subject and the filmmaker rarely share the same agenda. Steve wanted Mackenzie's innocence front and center. The producers wanted a compelling, complicated story. Those two goals produced very different edits. He openly admits there are parts of the documentary he appreciates, particularly the support it generated for his daughter's case. Your truth and their narrative are rarely the same cut. Remember that. Vehicular homicide and murder are not interchangeable. But in Mackenzie Shirilla's case, prosecutors chose the heavier weapon. Steve is unequivocal about this. The case, in his view, never should have left juvenile court. A teenager behind the wheel of a car that crashed, with no established intent, no prior calculation, and no demonstrable motive, should face a very different legal process than an adult charged with premeditated killing. The system made a choice, and that choice has consequences measured in decades. What separates vehicular homicide from murder legally is the presence of deliberate intent. Prosecutors must demonstrate that the defendant consciously chose to cause death, not that they drove recklessly, not that they made catastrophic decisions, but that they meant to kill. Steve's position is that not a single piece of presented evidence clears that bar convincingly. Intent is a legal requirement, not an assumption, not a guess. Think about what 7 years of institutional loyalty actually looks like in practice. 7 years of lesson plans, parent meetings, student breakthroughs, and professional investment in a school community. Steve Shirilla gave that to his institution without hesitation. Then a documentary aired, phones rang at the diocese, and within days he was escorted to the administrative sidelines without a single conversation, without a courtesy call, without the basic professional respect of being heard before being sidelined. What makes this particularly striking is the investigation's stated purpose to determine whether Steve's conduct warranted concern, yet the investigation launched without its primary subject being interviewed. That's not due diligence. That's reputation management dressed up as procedure. Steve isn't asking for immunity, he's asking for the conversation any 7-year employee deserves before their career gets placed on hold. Loyalty should survive at least one phone call, apparently not always. Here is the part of this story that rarely makes the headline. Mackenzie Shirilla has a genuine growing base of supporters who believe the conviction was a miscarriage of justice. The Free Mackenzie Shirilla movement exists, it is active, and it draws people who have examined the case details rather than reacted to the surface narrative. These aren't fringe conspiracy theorists, they are individuals troubled by the evidentiary gaps, the road conditions, the black box limitations, and the prosecutorial leap from unexplained to intentional. Steve points to this support not as vindication but as validation that reasonable people applying reasonable scrutiny arrive at reasonable doubt. That is precisely the standard a murder conviction is supposed to clear. Whether the courts ultimately revisit this case or not, the public conversation has already shifted meaningfully since the documentary aired in directions the prosecution likely did not anticipate. Public doubt, once planted, grows faster than any verdict can contain. Documentaries about criminal cases are a double-edged instrument. They can rehabilitate reputations or detonate them, sometimes simultaneously. For the Shirilla family, the TMZ documentary delivered both outcomes in the same runtime. Steve lost his professional standing almost immediately after it aired. But Mackenzie gained something arguably more valuable in the long run: renewed national attention on the weaknesses in her prosecution's case and a dramatically expanded audience for her innocence argument. Steve acknowledges the documentary wasn't the product he would have cut himself. Critical soundbites were isolated from their surrounding context. His marijuana comments overshadowed the automotive evidence his team spent considerable effort documenting. Yet the case is being talked about again, scrutinized again, and challenged again. For a father fighting for his convicted daughter, renewed scrutiny is not nothing. Sometimes the wrong story still opens the right door. Use it. Some cases close in courtrooms but never close in conscience. Mackenzie Shirilla's conviction sits firmly in that category. The black box recorded 4.74 seconds. The road dip was quietly repaired. The airbags deployed before the intersection. The marijuana markers were inconclusive. The prosecution admitted finding nothing that explained the crash, then called it murder anyway. Stack those facts side by side and the picture that emerges is not one of settled justice. It is one of compounded uncertainty dressed in a guilty verdict. Steve isn't asking the public to declare his daughter innocent. He is asking something far more foundational: that the standard of proof required for a murder conviction actually be met before a teenager spends decades in prison. Reasonable doubt isn't a technicality, it is the bedrock protection every defendant is constitutionally guaranteed, regardless of how horrific the outcome of their actions was. Unanswered questions inside a murder verdict should trouble everyone. Everyone. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a system that has already rendered its judgment. Steve Shirilla lives inside that exhaustion daily, navigating a daughter's imprisonment, a fractured public image, a suspended career, and a documentary that the whole country has now seen and formed opinions about. Yet here he is, still talking, still pushing, still pointing at the automotive reports and the road footage and the incomplete black box data and saying, "Look closer, because the full story was never told in that courtroom." What drives a parent past the point where most people would quietly accept defeat? Steve's answer requires no analysis. It is simply that he knows his daughter, knows the evidence, and refuses to allow an incomplete prosecution to write the final chapter. That refusal has cost him professionally, socially, and personally in ways that are still unfolding. Some fights choose you before you ever choose them. This one did. Here is what today's conversation ultimately forces onto the table: a black box with 4.74 seconds of data, a road hazard the city fixed without acknowledgement, airbags that deployed before the fatal moment, a prosecutor who admitted finding nothing and called it murder, a father placed on leave without a single conversation, and a documentary that simultaneously damaged one family member's career while reigniting the fight for another's freedom. None of these details exist in isolation. Together, they form a case that deserves far more scrutiny than a single conviction can permanently settle.
Whether you believe Mackenzie Shirilla is guilty, wrongly convicted, or somewhere in the complicated space between those two positions, the evidentiary questions Steve raises are legitimate and they are unresolved. Justice isn't served by speed or public pressure, it is served by getting the standard of proof exactly right every single time without exception.
If this case made you think differently, share it with someone who hasn't heard Steve's side yet. The conversation is far from finished. This content is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal or professional advice. Consult a qualified legal expert for guidance on specific legal matters.